Dana Denha here, and this is Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival. Historically, movies and television have a tendency to repeat the same material decade after decade, leaving many to ponder why there aren't fresh, creative ideas. The Ann Arbor Film Festival is a place to find those one of a kind ideas with art from all over the world in one place. Joining me is Andy Kirshner, writer, director, and composer, with a film at this year's fest 10 Questions for Henry Ford. Welcome to the show, Andy.
Thanks, Dana. Nice to be here. And
Well,
you have a kitten in the background.
oh,
Very
yeah.
cute.
Well, thank you. She loves to make cameos on every show I do at home.
She waited just to the perfect moment in the interview to walk in the background. So,
I always like to ask people, your background in schooling, what sort of led you to being, you're many things, you're multifaceted. But what led you to being like this really creative person making films?
it's kind of a roundabout journey. I started really in music. I was sort of most passionate about music. When I was 18, I wanted to play saxophone like Charlie Parker. That was kind of the only thing I wanted to do. And then gradually I became more interested in music composition, and that sort of led to theater and some performance art. And then as I was making theater productions, I was faced with documenting them. So that kind of led to video. And eventually I got tired of storing stage sets in my basement and hauling them around. And I kind of, rekindled an interest that I had, earlier interest that I'd had in photography. And that kind of led to filmmaking, which is kind of what I've mainly been doing for the last 10 years. But I've always been interested in storytelling. I've always been interested, particularly in musical storytelling. And so that's maybe a thread that goes through kind of all of my professional work.
And you currently work at University of Michigan, right? And you have you're like a one of a kind person at the University of Michigan.
Well, I have different hats. I'm a professor in the School of Art Design, Stamp School of Art and Design, and then I'm also a professor in the School of Music, Theater, and Dance, and I teach there in a program called Performing Arts Technology, which is kind of electronic music, music for media, recording arts. I teach mostly classes in music and sound for film.
Do you feel like your career as an educator has sort of shaped the filmmaking?
Yeah, I mean, it has. I started teaching at U of M about 20 years ago, and um, I was kind of thrown into this class that was called multimedia. That was kind of like, in the 90s, and it was like CD-ROMs.
Oh
And
yeah.
I think they kind of looked at me and they were like, "Oh, you look like the guy who knows how to plug in the printer. Maybe you should teach a class of multimedia." So that kind of led me to start, like pick up a video camera and start thinking about images a little bit more. And I'd done some sort of electronic music and found that there were a lot of similarities between kind of the production of music and the editing of music and the production of video and editing. So a lot of the skills sort of transferred over. So it was kind of accidental, and out of necessity, I started learning more about video. You got a real ham there.
She's, well, I guess this is about her show too. This is Riri
Yeah,
the
yeah.
cat.
Okay. Well, I'll cast her. I'll cast her in my next film if she's available. Yeah.
She could have been like on Henry Ford's shoulder or something like that.
Totally. Yes.
Talk about using all these different medias to create like these one piece. And are you putting your
Hmm.
music in a lot of your work, or are you hiring people to create music?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm kind of always using my own music. I mean, also will use like source music, like archive in the Henry Ford film. I used recordings of the Henry Ford Orchestra. He had his
Hmm.
own orchestra, of course. Um, but I think what it is that, like, I think different media are good for different things. So, music has a way of kind of touching the core of our emotions, but it's not particularly good at exposition of historical facts. um, and, words can do that. And images can do something else. The image of an actor can do something else. And so I've always been kind of interested in the way those things can interact, like how you can be watching an actor blink their eyes on the screen, and then there's some kind of musical underscore that informs how you interpret that blink of eye, and there's some kind of dramatic context that also informs how you interpret that. And that's sort of been, my continuing interest. I mean, I would say I'm not like an expert in any one thing. I'd say I'm pretty good in a lot of things, or let's say good enough. But I think maybe the thing that I'm most skilled at is understanding how media, um, can work together. And I think that's something that, just learn from the experience of like writing music for dance and writing music for theater and different kinds of contexts, and finding a lot of things that didn't work. So,
I appreciate how you mentioned, the life experiences really shape your career, and I can attest to that
mhm.
myself. I mean, you don't realize it at the time, but you're doing certain things that then will lead you to places to help you be better at the job you're currently doing.
Yeah, right. And then when you look back, it seems like, oh yeah, this is totally a logical story. But of course, there's so much chance involved. And I think it's true that like probably most people end up doing something professionally that they didn't imagine they were going to be doing. It's not what they were. I mean, I didn't really set out to be a filmmaker, but I kind of end up here, and it makes sense at this point in my life. So
Talk
yeah.
about some of your other films before we get into the one that's going to be
hmm
at this year's festival, because this isn't your first foray into filmmaking. You've made films in the past.
Yeah. Well, this is my second feature film. So I made a film that came out in 2016. It's called Liberty Secret, and it's basically a girl meets girl musical. So we were creating it sort of around the time of the marriage equality debate, and I always have kind of loved old musicals, but they have like terrible sexual politics and gender politics, and so I thought, okay, well maybe I'll make something that has that form of the sort of 1950s musical, but it has a little bit of a twist. So it's two women falling in love, and so anyway, so there's that film. I did a lot of I just did a short film that we premiered I guess it was last month. It's called Team Wristband, and it's based on a story by a writer named James Monroe Leaf, and it's about his experience with bipolar disorder. And it's a short film. It's like 20 minutes long, but it's kind of in an experimental vein, uh, very very kind of symbolistic or sometimes slightly surrealist film. So those are kinds of the things I've done. I feel like the work that I've done in theater before also connects, very directly to the sensibility that I have in film.
Sure. Yeah. One of the interesting things when I was reading about you was that you really know how to get funding for your projects. Do you help like students with that? Can you give advice to people? Because I think that's a big issue that people have a lot of times,
hmm
and they'll do
hmm
like GoFundMe's and stuff, and people aren't going to pay for that. I mean,
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
other ways to get funding.
yeah. Well, I do work my students on that, and there are some classes that I teach where, you know, their final project is to write a grant proposal. And I think, kind of years ago, and I can't even remember the name of the book, but it was something like, project funding in the arts or something
Hmm.
like that. And the key point in that book that I took away was, um, you don't just sort of go up to people and say, "Could you have money so I can make a film?" You create a project and you describe that project as sort of specifically as possible, in a way that will engage people, and you try to connect with people whose interests align with the message of your film or your project or whatever. And I've been on grant panels before, and very often, um, a lot of the descriptions that people write of their projects, they're probably great projects, but the descriptions are just too vague. And so, as somebody who's responsible for like giving away public funds or whatever, you just don't take the chance unless you really have an idea of what the person is going to do. And so, I mean, even more important than like, perhaps how much success somebody has had in the past is knowing what they're going to do and if the plan is realistic. So, I guess, yeah, I guess my advice would be, spend a lot of time on writing. Learn to write, have other people read your stuff, make sure that they understand um, what it is, and try to be concise and clear, and you're writing them. It's almost like writing a grant proposal, and I hate doing it, but I do it a lot. It's kind of like writing a poem. It's
Oh,
like
yeah.
you have to have this like very compressed, concise language that you know echoes outward and gives people a sense of what it is, and kind of gives them like sensory details and gives them an experience of what this piece is that you haven't made yet. And so that's something I feel like I've gradually learned how to do. Um,
Mentioned writing, that is such a skill that you really have to just keep doing to get better at.
hmm hmm
You're not going to just, I mean, some people are just going to be like a natural writer, I guess, but most of us
Yeah.
really have to work on that skill too.
Yeah, no, writing does not come, especially expository writing does not come easily to me. I'm not somebody who can just sit down and like crank it out.
Oh, sure, yeah.
I'd be a terrible journalist. Like I'd write one article a year. But yeah, no, but I think that's like one of the most valuable skills for artists, and especially independent artists, is writing well. Yeah.
Well, I will attest to you because you gave me all this wonderful information about you, and I don't always receive that about people. You gave me this awesome
Oh.
list of everything that I would have ever wanted to know about you, which made
Oh.
my life so much easier.
Well, that's also yeah, definitely that's also advice for artists, and that's something else that I've learned over the years is make it as easy as possible for people to write about you and interview you. You know, just like give them the materials because a lot of times, like if you send out a press release, um, you know, to a variety of publications, a lot of times they'll just publish the press release, right? Like if
Oh,
they don't
sure.
necessarily have time, so you just make it easy for them. You have the pictures for them. I usually have stuff like on a Google Drive, you know, so people can just find it and get what they need. So yeah, that also helps.
Advice I have for people is don't be afraid to ask people to review your writing either. I think that's a great,
Yeah,
like, ask your
absolutely.
friends to look at your writing and see what you can
Yeah,
fix on it, what they can hone in to just make it sound as the best it can
yeah.
be.
And also to look at your work. I mean, I really believe in, finding people that you trust and letting them look at your work. You know, not when you're like the first day you're working on it, but when you feel like
Sure.
you've arrived at a point where you need feedback. I feel like like the Henry Ford film. I mean, went through so many incarnations and changes and restructurings, and I feel pretty satisfied by where it is now. But there were definitely times when it was fairly incoherent, and friends would tell me when the parts that were incoherent, or if you're preparing a work sample for a grant or something like that, it's really helpful to get feedback from someone who doesn't know the project and say, hey, if you look at this, do you know what I'm doing? So yeah, feedback. Hmm.
Well, let's watch as Andy brings Henry Ford's legacy to life in the trailer for 10 Questions for Henry Ford.
I gotta think he's around here somewhere. I keep thinking I've seen him, but it's only a mirage. Some curlicue pattern in the brick, or sunlight sparkling on the roofs just the right way. So I just keep looking, retracing my steps, walking backward in time. What else is there to do? Edsel and I didn't always understand each other. I figure there's a few things I could say if I ever do find him. Although I still don't know exactly what.
We're back with Andy Kirshner. I'd like to know why Henry Ford. A lot of people have written about Henry Ford. We know a lot about Henry Ford, but your take on Henry Ford's
Hmm.
really different. But
Hmm.
why? Why did you choose? He is very
Hmm.
controversial, but why
Hmm.
him?
Well, I mean, as being a Michigander, Henry Ford is pretty much everywhere. So
Oh
there's
my
a
gosh. I actually, my first job out of college was in Dearborn, so it was like Henry
okay,
Ford land.
right, right, right. Dearborn especially, but all over Michigan, Southeast Michigan.
Definitely, yeah.
So there's this part of Henry Ford's legacy, and there's this sort of entrepreneur and a certain kind of mythology that he created around himself. I mean, obviously he was a brilliant entrepreneur and mechanic, but he also created this kind of image of himself as a sort of American rags to riches hero. Um, but there's this other part of Henry Ford's legacy that is pretty dark, and it has to do with his anti-Semitism and the influence of his anti-Semitic publications on the rest of the world, including the early Nazi movement. And then there's also his relationship with labor. In the early part of his success, he had this kind of cultivated this image as sort of the friend of the working man. Um,
Yeah, it
but
was
he
like
was
he was
actually,
giving people cars that were really cheap and stuff like that's like the one story you hear
mhm.
about him all the time that he was giving cars to his employees for next to nothing, so they all could have a car.
Yeah, so there may have been an insight there about, making your workers into consumers. But then there's this other part of legacy, which is that he always resisted unions. And when the going got really tough during the Depression in the 1930s, I mean, he was absolutely brutal. So he had this enforcer named Harry Bennett, who had all these ties to organized crime and, um, various vigilante organizations and militias and so forth. And, they literally killed, union organizers during demonstrations and beat people up and, all that kind of stuff were absolutely ruthless. And there's also like this very strong, kind of white supremacist aspect to, anti-Semitism is, it is connected to white nationalism. Like behind every white nationalist conspiracy theory, there's Jews somewhere, and and Henry Ford was kind of part of that lineage. And so here we are in this moment, like around 2016, and the sort of resurgence of all these uh, white nationalist groups, which of course have always been there, right? But they're sort of raising their ugly heads in places like Charlottesville,
Hmm.
and it just seemed like it was a time that some of the things that I was researching about Henry Ford in the 1920s and the 1930s and various kind of anti-immigration movements of the 20s from the nativist, isolationist movements were very much like 2016, 2017. And I felt like there's this history that I knew a little about, but not that much about. And also that I found a lot of people, a lot of my friends, people who are very well educated and otherwise might know a lot of American history, really didn't know about how much influence Henry Ford had in these kind of, sort of nascent American fascist movements. And, I mean, Hitler had a giant portrait of Henry Ford in his office, called him his inspiration, said if Henry Ford ran for president, he was going to send his shock troops to help him out. So there's all these kind of like pretty ugly connections. Um, and so anyway, it just seemed like a movie for this time, in the same way that like you know there's this value in re-examining the legacy of slavery in in the United States, and even understanding it as sort of foundational in some way. Along with the Declaration of Independence, there's also slavery, right? And I think along with the brilliant entrepreneurship and all the jobs that Henry Ford created, there's also this ugly aspect of fascism and white supremacy that I think we have to kind of look at it all to really
Yeah, I
understand
agree with you
ourselves
because I
and
feel like
understand the time we live in.
yeah,
Go
because
ahead. Yeah.
I feel like when people die,
Hmm.
especially someone that's like a celebrity, Henry Ford was a
Hmm.
celebrity at the time, and
Hmm.
he's a historical figure, but people always look
Hmm.
at these people with rose-colored glasses. And I never
Hmm.
understand that because it's not like you were friends with Henry Ford or Michael Jackson or whoever it might
Right.
be. But
Right.
it's like
Steve
we
Jobs or whatever.
yeah, because
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
not going to be healthy for any of us to say these things never happened because they did happen.
Yeah.
And we
Right.
need to change. We need to change the behavior so it doesn't happen anymore. Because when 2016 started rolling around, you're talking about all the stuff that happened, that made me sick in my heart. I mean, I could just sit
Hmm.
and cry about the things that were happening because I don't want to live in a world like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think most of us don't, but there is like a minority and a very strong minority and a very violent minority that, I mean, one of the things that I was kind of learning as I was researching this piece is that, people tend to think of like the Ku Klux Klan as being associated with, a reaction to Reconstruction, and it's true they were sort of active in that period after the Civil War. But there's also this sort of second resurgence of the Klan that starts in the early teen or around 1915, and it was largely centered in Michigan, Indiana, Ohio. It was like a Midwestern movement, and it was not just like your sort of rabid racist, caricature of a Southerner plantation owner, but it was like your middle class doctors and dentists from Peoria or from Detroit or from wherever, and it was a mainstream American movement, and I think it's important for us to reckon with that, not to pretend that what we're experiencing now is just some kind of aberration, but understand what the roots of it and how deep it goes.
Talk about the format of the film, this like idea
Hmm.
of asking questions to Henry Ford
Hmm.
and the actor that you cast, because I'm sure that's actually not an easy feat to cast someone
Hmm.
as someone that we all already know.
Well, the 10 questions, the title actually comes from a description of an interview that someone tried to do with Henry Ford, early in his career, where they asked him 10 questions, and most of them he
The
said he didn't know
engineers
the
wanted
answer
more
to,
co-gunners,
because it was before he
but they
became
couldn't make the
famous,
numbers
and he
without
was
them.
he was actually a lot more humble.
So they talked to
Um,
Edsel,
but I kind of got
Edsel
this
brings
idea of
in
like a
two
newspaper interview,
experts.
and
When they get
specifically the
a good
kinds of
idea, he
questions
tells them to go
that I would
ahead.
like to ask Henry Ford if he
The
were
thing
in
is,
front of me.
he
You know,
never
these
asked me
just like,
about it.
why did you hate Jews? Like, what was the impetus for
Good
that?
hair. Both
He was
were
also
really
another
happy.
sort of major theme of the
Since
film
we're
is his
hairy,
relationship
we'll let
with his
Edsel
son
pump those
Edsel,
eyes. As soon as he's
and
finished,
who he
we're going to knock
he
him right
loved
down.
but also undermined and really sabotaged. And
Yeah, you
so,
you gave me a
one of
clip
the
where they specifically talk
So
about
that's
that,
what we
like where
did.
he lets him take
Mhm.
over the factory or whatever, and then he's like, "But
Mhm.
I'm
Some
just
people
gonna
say I was
throw out
cruel to
everything he
do
does,"
that.
kind of thing.
Yeah,
Like,
Some
yeah.
say since I made
that's
him
your
so
Right,
son.
which
many
is,
times
I
get
mean,
sent back to
that's your
work,
son. It's mysterious. I mean,
I had to teach him a lesson.
it's not like
You see,
family relationships
Edsel was
aren't
put
always
away for his
complicated, but
biology.
the specifics of
We had
that
to study things over
relationship
6
were
ways from
interesting to
Sunday before
me.
we could
So
make a
that
decision.
was sort of the questions, and then, the other sort of
I
conceit of the
finally
film is that
admitted
Henry Ford is
I didn't
a
know how to make a
ghost,
Model
and
T.
he's coming,
Hell, I
he's
never left
here,
the farm.
and this kind of connects to the idea of history,
He was too soft.
continuing to influence the present.
That's all there
Even the
is
history
to
that
it.
we don't acknowledge
Hmm.
continues to
Always listening to
influence the
people,
present.
asking them to say
Um,
their opinions,
and so,
telling
we
them what to
literally
do
see
and
him
making them
walking
do it.
around Detroit, Southeast Michigan,
He could
Ypsilanti,
have been more like Harry.
as a ghost. And and I wanted to draw that
And I could have
connection
just
between
sat
past
back
and
and
present,
relaxed
and
and
give
done
that
my
sense
thing.
that, legacy of Henry Ford is sort of literally and or figuratively and in the film kind of literally living in the present.
Well, upon making this film, was there anything that you were really surprised to find out? Because, like I said, we both said it. There's things about Henry Ford that you hear about all the time, and most of it's
Hmm.
the good stuff. And then you'll
Hmm.
occasionally hear some of the bad stuff. But were you surprised by
Yeah.
any of the facts that you found out?
I was, and let me just, sorry, I forgot to answer another one of your questions about the actor. I just wanted to mention
Oh,
that
yeah, yeah.
John Leopard is the actor who plays Henry Ford, who I had worked with before in another film. And in some ways, I decided to do the project based on knowing him and thinking he'd be really great at it. He just has this very kind of understated quality. He's from Michigan. I mean, his dad was an auto worker. Like, he kind of understands
Gets it.
Michigan, and he has a Michigan accent. So I thought he was kind of very believable. He's also like very charming, And I didn't want to make Henry like into a complete villain because he was charming. He was able to motivate people to go along with him, and there's a reason why he was a folk hero. Um, and so I wanted someone that you could at one minute feel charmed by and attracted to, and at the moment, and the next moment you could see something that they'd done and be really,
Disgusted.
find it really repulsive. I guess a couple of things surprised me. I mean, one is that, as I mentioned, I knew about Ford's anti-Semitism, but I didn't realize how influential it had been, and to the point where these articles that he published in his newspaper that he bought, the Dearborn Independent, they were collected in a book and they were ultimately reprinted in 16 languages, went all around the world, and they became hugely influential in Germany, and went through multiple reprintings. And there were even people at the Nuremberg trials, the war crimes trials after the war, who said, one man in particular who said, "Yeah, I actually became an anti-Semite not from listening to Hitler, but from listening to Henry Ford, because we saw this man who was so hugely successful and who we so admired, and he was an anti-Semite, so naturally we all were too." So I was really taken aback by that. I didn't know. I thought it was just like some kind of private bigotry, or just
I
limited to the
honestly
United
did
States.
too. I didn't even know
Yeah.
about the Dearborn Independent until I read
Mm.
about your stuff. I really didn't know about that publication. So, I mean, it really shines
Yeah,
a
a lot of
bigger
people
light on the
don't.
picture.
Bankers own it.
Hmm.
The
A lot of people don't. And then there's also just some really like quirky things about Henry Ford that I didn't know. Like he was a strong believer in reincarnation. He had all these interests in kind of, dietary, extreme diets, like where he would only eat carrots for a couple of weeks, or thought you could live forever if you only ate cracked wheat.
Oh, he's like your
Things,
stereotypical celebrity, right? Like,
yeah, right, exactly. So, and I mean, he had this like part of what is charming about him, just to like make it a little more balanced. He did have this curiosity, this kind of insatiable curiosity for things, and like, he was really interested in Ralph Waldo Emerson, and he would carry around, Emerson's essays in his back pocket, and he'd like kind of underline them and write notes on it, and somebody would mention something to him, and then also he had this kind of obsession with square dancing, and which ends up kind of being a motif in the film, and I didn't really know that much about that either, and I found that really interesting, and those are the kinds of things that like I always love sort of weird but true things.
I
And
agree with you. I mean, like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
finding out, like like Abraham Lincoln, and they used to do seances all the time, like that kind of stuff. It's all fun
right,
and
right,
weird because it's
exactly.
like just unexpected. You don't think people of that sort of power and stuff even believe in that sort of, as they say, wah wah sort of
Yeah, right, right.
behavior.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's true, and it also just fills out the human being, right? So
Yeah,
they
yeah.
don't just become like a symbol, but that's actually a living, breathing person. So yeah,
Well,
those are all
Andy,
things
we're
that.
out of time, but before we
Yeah.
go,
Okay.
tell people why they should check out your film at the festival this year, and just check out the Ann Arbor Film Festival in general.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the Ann Arbor Film Festival, if you don't know, I mean, it's a venerable institution. It's, this is what, the 60th year. And it's really like, one of the premier international venues for experimental film. And, I feel really fortunate to be in the film. You're going to see some stuff you love. You're going to see some stuff you don't love. But you're going to see some stuff that is, you're not going to see anywhere else. And I think it's such a unique opportunity for those of us who live in Ann Arbor. I'd love you to see my film. This is actually going to be sort of the first, because of COVID, this is like the first screening in a movie theater, and it may be the last one for a while.
Yeah.
So this is an opportunity for you to see the film on a big screen with surround sound, with an audience. I'm so excited about myself because I've just done like virtual screenings and screenings with small groups of people. So I hope people will come out and enjoy the film and enjoy the rest of the festival as well. It's a scene, as you know.
To watch this and other CTN series, visit youtube.com/CTN Ann Arbor. And remember to like, subscribe, and share. I'm Dana Denha for Let's Watch with the Ann Arbor Film Festival.